You don't belong here." The words cut through the elegant chatter of the wedding reception like a blade through silk. Every conversation stopped. Every champagne glass paused midway to painted lips. Every eye in the opulent ballroom turned toward the source of the venom. Derek Cole stood in his $1,000 tuxedo, his perfectly styled hair catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above, pointing an accusatory finger at a young woman who had been trying to disappear into the shadows near the service entrance. She wore a faded dress that had seen better years, her dark hair hanging in uneven strands around a face that seemed carved from both sorrow and steel. "Did you hear me?" Derek's voice carried across the room, amplified by his own sense of righteousness and the acoustics of the grand estate. "I said you don't belong here." The woman, barely more than a girl, really, froze like a deer caught in headlights. Her hands, rough and scarred from work Derek couldn't begin to imagine, trembled as she clutched a small, worn envelope to her chest. "Derek, please," his bride Claire started, but he held up a hand to silence her without even looking in her direction. "No, Claire. This is exactly what's wrong with the world today. People thinking they can just show up anywhere they want, take what isn't theirs, eat food they didn't pay for." He took a step closer to the trembling girl, his voice rising with each word. "Security clearly failed us today, but I won't." The girl's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. Her eyes, startlingly familiar green eyes that seemed to hold depths of pain no one her age should carry, darted around the room like a trapped animal seeking escape. "Look at her," Derek continued, his tone dripping with disgust as he gestured broadly at her appearance. "Those clothes probably came from a thrift store dumpster. Those shoes have holes in them. She probably hasn't showered in weeks. And she thinks she can just waltz into the most important day of my life." A few of the guests began to murmur uncomfortably. Some pulled out their phones, undoubtedly recording what they assumed would be some viral moment of a wealthy man putting a poor girl in her place. The girl's breathing became shallow, rapid. Her free hand pressed against her chest as if trying to hold her heart inside her ribcage. "I'm calling security," Derek announced, reaching for his phone. "And then I'm pressing charges for trespassing. Maybe a night in jail will teach you that there are consequences for." "Stop." The word came out as barely a whisper, but it carried enough pain to make even Derek pause. The girl raised her head slowly, and for the first time, the full impact of her face was visible to everyone in the room. The bone structure was delicate but strong. The green eyes held flecks of gold that caught the light. The mouth, despite being pressed thin with fear, had a natural curve that spoke of someone who had once smiled easily. Claire's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor. "Oh my God," she breathed, her face going white as fresh snow. The girl's eyes locked onto Claire's across the crowded room, and in that moment, the resemblance became undeniable. They had the same nose, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting their heads when they were afraid. "Hello, Claire," the girl said, her voice stronger now, though it carried the weight of years. "I know I shouldn't have come. I know everyone thinks I'm dead. But I had to see you get married. I had to see that you were happy." The envelope in her hands was trembling so violently now that the paper was making soft rustling sounds. "I was just going to leave this and go," she continued, holding up the envelope. "I wrote you a letter. Every year on your birthday. Every Christmas. Every time I missed you so much I thought I might die from it. I kept them all, thinking maybe someday." Claire's hand flew to her mouth, tears already streaming down her carefully applied makeup. "Glenda," she whispered. "Glenda, is that really you?" The name hit the assembled guests like a physical blow. Glenda Hartwell, Claire's twin sister. The girl who had supposedly died in a car accident 6 years ago when they were both 16. The girl whose funeral had been closed casket because the fire had been too intense. The girl whose death had nearly destroyed the entire Hartwell family. Derek's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then a dawning horror as he realized what he had just done. In front of 200 of the city's most influential people, he had just humiliated and threatened to have arrested his bride's supposedly dead sister. "That's impossible," he stammered, but his voice had lost all its authority. "She's dead. We went to her funeral. Claire's parents. My parents thought I was dead because that's what I let them think," Glenda said, her voice growing steadier with each word, though tears were now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Because sometimes loving someone means disappearing so they don't have to watch you destroy yourself." She took a shaky step forward, and the crowd parted instinctively, creating a clear path between the two sisters. "I've been living in Portland, working at a diner, sleeping in a room above a laundromat, Learning how to be human again after. She swallowed hard. After what happened that night wasn't an accident. The revelation sent another shock wave through the room. Claire let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. I saw your engagement announcement in the paper, Glenda continued, her eyes never leaving her sister's face. I've been saving money for 8 months to buy a bus ticket. I just wanted to see you one more time. To make sure you were okay. To give you these letters so you'd know I never stopped loving you, even when I was too broken to come home. Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well. Drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far and where you are watching from. Some stories are too close to my heart to share on YouTube. I send those, along with little life lessons and surprises, to my email circle. If you'd like to be part of it, you can join with the link in the description. Derek stood frozen in the middle of his own wedding reception, surrounded by witnesses to his cruelty, facing the impossible reality that the homeless girl he had just publicly humiliated was his bride's sister. A sister who had returned from the dead carrying 6 years of love letters and wearing 6 years of scars. The envelope in Glenda's hands contained more than letters. As she held it out toward Claire with shaking fingers, a single photograph fell out and fluttered to the floor. Claire rushed forward and snatched it up, her hands trembling as she stared at the image. It was a picture of the two of them at their 16th birthday party, just 3 weeks before the night that changed everything. They were wearing matching dresses their mother had bought them, laughing at some joke they had shared, their arms wrapped around each other as if nothing in the world could ever tear them apart. Claire looked up from the photograph to her sister's face, seeing not the scared, poorly dressed girl that Derek had humiliated, but the other half of her own soul that had been missing for 6 years. Glenda, she whispered again, and this time the name carried the weight of every prayer she had whispered in the dark, every birthday wish she had made, every desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, her sister might still be alive. But as the two sisters stared at each other across the wreckage of what was supposed to be the happiest day of Claire's life, one question hung in the air like poison. If Glenda had been alive all this time, why had she let everyone believe she was dead? And what exactly had happened that night 6 years ago that was so terrible it had driven a 16-year-old girl to fake her own death rather than face the truth? The answer, when it came, would destroy more than just a wedding. The silence stretched across the ballroom like a taut wire ready to snap. 200 wedding guests stood frozen, phones still recording, champagne still untouched, as they witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. Claire took a trembling step toward her sister, then another, until she was close enough to see the small scar above Glenda's left eyebrow, the one she'd gotten when they were 7 and had tried to build a treehouse without adult supervision. It is you, Claire breathed, reaching out with shaking fingers to touch her sister's face. Oh God, Glenda, it's really you. But Glenda flinched away from the touch, and Claire's hand fell back to her side. Don't, Glenda whispered. Please don't touch me. I'm not the same person I was. The wedding planner, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Nash, appeared at Derek's elbow. Her face was pale but her voice was steady as she whispered urgently in his ear. We need to move this conversation some way private. Now, half the people here have their phones out, and this is going to be all over social media in minutes. Derek nodded numbly, still staring at Glenda as if she might disappear again if he looked away. The library, Claire said suddenly, her voice barely audible. We can go to the library. It's quiet there. She turned to address the crowd, her voice shaking but determined. Everyone, please continue enjoying the reception. We just need a few minutes to figure this out. The murmur that rose from the guests was like the sound of distant thunder. But they began to disperse, some heading to the bar, others gathering in small groups to whisper about what they had just witnessed. As the crowd thinned, a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes approached the small group. Dr. Robert Hayes had been the Hartwell family physician for 20 years, and he had been the one to identify Glenda's body after the accident, or what everyone had believed was her body. Claire, he said gently, but his eyes were fixed on Glenda with an expression of shock and something else, something that looked almost like guilt. Perhaps I should join you. This is medically significant. Glenda's head snapped up at the sound of his voice, and for a moment, raw terror flashed across her features. You, she whispered. You're here. Dr. Hayes' face went ashen. Glenda, You knew, she said, her voice growing stronger, angrier. You knew I was alive. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Claire looked back and forth between them, confusion and dawning horror warring on her face. What is she talking about? Claire demanded. Dr. Hayes, what is she talking about? But before he could answer, another voice cut through the tension. Well, Glenda Hartwell. Back from the dead. Everyone turned to see a woman in an elegant navy dress approaching them. She was in her 40s, with expertly styled blonde hair and the kind of confidence that came from old money. This was Miranda Cole, Derek's mother, and the look in her eyes was cold as winter. Mother, Derek started, but she held up a perfectly manicured hand to silence him. I wondered when you'd turn up, Miranda continued, her gaze fixed on Glenda. Though I must say, your timing is impeccable. Couldn't let your sister have one day of happiness without making it about yourself, could you? Miranda, Dr. Hayes said sharply. That's enough. Is it? Miranda's smile was sharp as a knife. Because I think our young Glenda here has some explaining to do. Starting with how she managed to fake her own death and disappear for 6 years. Glenda's face had gone white, but her chin lifted defiantly. I didn't fake anything. I was supposed to die that night. Everyone expected me to die. So I let them think I had. Glenda, what are you saying? Claire's voice was barely a whisper. For the first time since she'd entered the ballroom, Glenda's composure began to crack. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked at her sister. Do you remember that night? Our birthday party, she asked. Everyone was so happy. Mom and Dad had bought us matching cars, those little red convertibles we'd been begging for. We were so excited to finally have our freedom. Claire nodded, tears beginning to flow down her own face. You wanted to go to Jake's party. I wanted to stay home and watch movies with Mom and Dad. We fought about it, Glenda continued. You said I was being reckless. I said you were being boring. We said terrible things to each other. The memory was clearly painful for both of them. Claire reached out again, and this time Glenda didn't pull away. I went to the party alone, Glenda said. I was so angry at you. I drank too much. Way too much. And then Jake Henderson said he'd drive me home. The name hit Dr. Hayes like a physical blow. His face went gray, and he sank into a nearby chair. Jake, Claire breathed. But Jake died in the accident too. You were both. Jake didn't die, Glenda said quietly. Jake was never in the car. The revelation sent shockwaves through the small group. Miranda Cole's expression shifted from smugness to something approaching alarm. That's impossible, Derek said. The police report said. The police report said what people needed it to say, Glenda interrupted, her voice growing stronger. What was easier for everyone to believe? She turned to Dr. Hayes, who was staring at his hands. Tell them, she said. Tell them what really happened that night. Dr. Hayes looked up, his eyes filled with a pain that seemed to have aged him years in the past few minutes. Glenda, he said softly, you don't understand what you're asking. I understand perfectly, she replied. I've had 6 years to understand. 6 years to live with what I did. 6 years to hate myself for being alive when someone else died because of my choices. Claire's grip on her sister's hand tightened. Glenda, what are you saying? Who died? Your cousin Rosalind, Miranda Cole said suddenly, her voice sharp and cold. Rosalind died in that car. The words hit Claire like a physical blow. Rosalind Hartwell, their 17-year-old cousin, the daughter of their father's brother. Sweet, shy Rosalind who had always looked up to the twins, who had been at their birthday party that night. Rosalind was supposed to get a ride home with you, Claire whispered, the pieces beginning to fall into place. When you left early, she went with you instead. Glenda nodded, tears streaming down her face. She begged me not to let Jake drive. She said he'd been drinking. She said we should call someone. But I was so angry, so stupid. I told her she was being a baby. I got in the car, and she got in too because she didn't want to be left alone at the party. The weight of the truth was crushing. Claire sank into a chair, her wedding dress pooling around her like a broken dream. Jake lost control on Riverside Drive, Glenda continued. The car went through the guardrail. When I woke up, I was in the water. Rosalind was. Her voice broke. Rosalind was trapped. The doors wouldn't open. I tried to get her out, but the current was too strong. I watched her drown, and I couldn't save her. Dr. Hayes spoke quietly, his voice filled with decades of regret. When they pulled Glenda out of the river 2 miles downstream, she was nearly dead. Hypothermia, internal bleeding, severe trauma. She begged me not to tell anyone she was alive. She said Rosalind's death was her fault, and she couldn't face her family knowing what she'd done. So you helped her disappear, Claire said, her voice hollow with shock. I falsified the death certificate, Dr. Hayes admitted. I said the body was too damaged to identify. I had Rosalind cremated and told everyone it was Glenda. And I helped Glenda start over somewhere else. Miranda Cole's face was a mask of cold fury. And you never thought to tell anyone. You let the Hartwells grieve for the wrong child. Rosalind's parents were told she died, Dr. Hayes said defensively. They knew their daughter was gone. But they didn't know why, Miranda snapped. They didn't know their daughter died because of this girl's reckless stupidity. Glenda flinched as if she'd been slapped, but she didn't argue. The guilt she'd carried for 6 years was written in every line of her face. Where's Jake? Derek asked suddenly. If he didn't die in the accident, where is he? The question hung in the air like poison. Glenda's face went even paler, if that was possible. Jake Henderson is upstairs, Miranda Cole said with vicious satisfaction. He's been upstairs this entire time. He's my nephew, and he's been living in my guest house for the past 3 years. The betrayal hit like a sledgehammer. Jake Henderson, the boy who had been driving the car that night, who had let 2 families believe he was dead while a teenage girl carried the guilt of his choices, was here. At the wedding. He had been here the entire time Glenda was being humiliated in front of 200 people. Claire looked at her sister, at the woman who had sacrificed everything to protect a secret that wasn't even hers to carry, and felt her heart break all over again. He's been alive this whole time, she whispered. And you've been living like a ghost. Glenda nodded, unable to speak. And now he's upstairs, Claire continued, her voice growing stronger, angrier. At my wedding, while you stood down here alone, being treated like garbage. The pieces of the betrayal were falling into place, and the picture they formed was uglier than anyone could have imagined. Not only had Glenda been carrying the guilt for Rosalind's death alone, but the person truly responsible had been living comfortably under his aunt's protection while she struggled to survive. But the worst betrayal was still to come. Because as the small group absorbed the weight of these revelations, footsteps could be heard on the marble staircase above them. Jake Henderson was coming downstairs, and with him would come the final truth that would shatter what remained of everything they thought they knew about that night 6 years ago. The footsteps on the marble staircase echoed through the ballroom like a countdown to disaster. Each step brought Jake Henderson closer to a confrontation that had been 6 years in the making, and Glenda felt her entire body begin to shake. I can't, she whispered, backing toward the service entrance. I can't see him. I can't. But Claire caught her arm, and for the first time since this nightmare began, her voice carried the steel that Glenda remembered from their childhood. You're not running again, Claire said firmly. Not this time. We're going to face this together. Jake Henderson appeared at the top of the staircase, and the sight of him sent another shock wave through the group. He was no longer the lanky teenager from 6 years ago. He'd filled out, grown into his height, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never had to sleep in a room above a laundromat or work double shifts at a diner just to survive. He wore an expensive suit, not as expensive as Derek's, but far nicer than anything Glenda had owned in years. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and he moved with the easy grace of someone who had spent the last 6 years being taken care of rather than barely surviving. When his eyes found Glenda across the room, he stopped dead. Jesus Christ, he breathed, his face going white. Glenda. The way he said her name, like a prayer, like a curse, like something that hurt to even speak, made everyone in the group turn to stare at him. Hello, Jake, Glenda said, her voice barely audible but steady. Enjoying the party. He descended the remaining stairs slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. As he got closer, the resemblance between him and Miranda Cole became obvious. The same sharp cheekbones, the same calculating eyes. I thought you were dead, he said when he reached the bottom of the staircase. All these years, I thought you were dead. I was supposed to be, Glenda replied. That was the plan, wasn't it? The question hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment, his carefully constructed composure cracked. That was never the plan, he said urgently. Glenda, you have to believe me. I never wanted. Stop. The word came from Claire, sharp and commanding. She stepped between her sister and Jake, her wedding dress rustling with the movement. Just stop talking. She turned to face the small group that had gathered around them. Derek, his mother Miranda, Dr. Hayes, and Victoria the wedding planner, who was still trying to manage damage control. Everyone out, Claire said firmly. This conversation is happening in private. Claire, honey, I don't think, Derek started, but she cut him off with a look that could have frozen hellfire. I said everyone out. This is my family's business. Miranda Cole stepped forward, her face hard with anger. Jake is my nephew. If this involves him, then it involves me. Then you should have thought about that before you let my sister be humiliated in front of 200 people while you kept the person actually responsible for Rosalind's death hidden upstairs like some dirty secret. Claire shot back. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Miranda's face flushed red, but she held her ground. You don't know what you're talking about, she said coldly. You don't know what really happened that night. Then tell me, Claire demanded. Tell me what really happened. Jake stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. I'll tell you, he said quietly. I'll tell you everything. But Miranda's right, you don't know the whole story. He looked at Glenda, and the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. Neither do you. The words hit Glenda like a slap. What are you talking about? I was there, Jake. I remember everything. Do you? He asked gently. Do you remember everything? Or do you remember what the trauma let you remember? Dr. Hayes, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly looked up sharply. Jake, don't. No, Jake said firmly. She has the right to know. They all do. He turned back to Glenda, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with a pain that seemed to match her own. You don't remember the phone call, do you? He asked. The one that came right before we left the party. Glenda frowned, confusion flickering across her features. What phone call? The one from Rosalind, Jake said quietly. The one where she was crying so hard she could barely speak. The room went silent except for the distant sounds of the wedding reception continuing in the ballroom beyond. Claire felt her heart begin to race as she sensed they were approaching something terrible. Rosalind called you that night, Jake continued, his eyes fixed on Glenda's face. She was at Riverside Drive. She'd been there for hours, trying to work up the courage to jump. The words hit the group like a bomb blast. Claire's hand flew to her mouth, and Dr. Hayes sank deeper into his chair. That's not possible, Glenda whispered. Rosalind wasn't suicidal. She was shy, but she was happy. She was being molested by her stepfather, Jake said bluntly, and the words seemed to suck all the air out of the room. She had been for months. She tried to tell people, but no one believed her. Her mother called her a liar. Her father said she was making it up for attention. Claire felt the world tilt around her. Rosalind Hartwell, sweet 17-year-old Rosalind, who had always seemed so young for her age, so fragile. She called you because she trusted you, Jake continued, his voice breaking slightly. She said you were the only person who had ever really listened to her. She was standing on the bridge, and she called to say goodbye. Glenda's face had gone deathly pale. I don't remember, she whispered. You were drunk, Jake said gently. Really drunk. But when you heard her crying, you sobered up fast. You grabbed me and said we had to go. You said Rosalind was in trouble and we had to get to her before. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Before she jumped, Dr. Hayes finished quietly. That's why you were driving so fast that night. You weren't being reckless for fun. You were trying to save Rosalind's life. The revelation hit Glenda like a physical blow. She staggered backward, and Claire caught her before she could fall. That's why I couldn't let them blame you, Jake said, tears now streaming down his face. You were driving that fast because you were trying to save her. When the car went off the road, when Rosalind drowned, it wasn't because you were being selfish or stupid. It was because you were trying to be a hero. But she still died, Glenda said, her voice hollow. She still died because of choices I made. She died because her stepfather was a monster, Jake said firmly. She died because the adults in her life failed to protect her. She died because the world had already broken her spirit long before that night. Miranda Cole had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, and now she stepped forward, her face twisted with anger. That's enough, she snapped. This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the facts. Rosalind Hartwell is dead, and you two were responsible for the car that killed her. Actually, Dr. Hayes said quietly, that's not entirely accurate either. Everyone turned to stare at him, and the old doctor seemed to age another decade under their collective gaze. Rosalind didn't drown, he said softly. The water didn't kill her. The silence that followed was deafening. What are you saying? Claire whispered. Dr. Hayes looked up, his eyes filled with a guilt that seemed to have been eating him alive for 6 years. Rosalind had severe internal injuries from the crash, he said. But she was still alive when they pulled her from the water. She was conscious. She was talking. He paused, seeming to gather his courage. She lived for 3 hours in the hospital. Long enough to tell me what had been happening to her at home. Long enough to beg me not to let her stepfather visit her. Long enough to ask me to tell her cousin Glenda that she was grateful. That even though the rescue attempt had failed, it was the first time in months that someone had tried to save her instead of hurt her. The weight of this revelation was crushing. Glenda collapsed into a chair, her whole body shaking with sobs. She was grateful, Dr. Hayes continued. With her dying breath, she was grateful that someone had cared enough to try. Then why? Claire demanded, her voice raw with emotion. Why did you let everyone believe that Glenda was responsible? Why did you help her disappear? Because 3 hours after Rosalind died, Dr. Hayes said, his voice barely audible, her stepfather showed up at the hospital asking very specific questions about who had been driving the car that night. He wanted to know if anyone had talked to Rosalind before she died. He wanted to know if she had said anything about anything. The implication hit the room like a sledgehammer. He was going to kill Glenda, Jake said quietly. If he knew she was alive, if he thought Rosalind might have told her something, he was going to kill her. So we let him think she was already dead, Dr. Hayes finished. It was the only way to keep her safe. But even as the truth of that terrible night finally came to light, a new horror was unfolding. Because Miranda Cole's face had gone from angry to calculating, and the look in her eyes suggested that the danger Dr. Hayes had tried to protect Glenda from 6 years ago might not be as far in the past as they had hoped. Well, Miranda said slowly, a cold smile spreading across her lips. This is all very interesting. But there's just one problem with your touching story. She pulled out her phone and showed them the screen. It displayed a text message conversation, and the timestamp showed it had been sent just minutes ago. I've been keeping Rosalind's stepfather informed about this situation, she said calmly, and he's very interested to learn that the witness to his stepdaughter's abuse allegations is not only alive but has just publicly identified herself in front of 200 people. The room erupted in chaos as the full implications of her betrayal sank in. Jake lunged toward his aunt, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. You called him, he shouted. Miranda, what have you done? But Miranda just smiled, her phone already ringing as she placed another call. I've done what needed to be done to protect this family's reputation, she said coldly. And now, Glenda Hartwell, you're going to disappear again. Permanently this time. The point of no return had been reached. The truth was finally out, but the danger that had driven Glenda into hiding 6 years ago was now bearing down on them with twice the fury and all the desperation of a man who had spent years believing his darkest secret was buried with his victim. And this time, there would be nowhere to run. The phone call ended, and Miranda Cole's satisfied smile sent ice through everyone's veins. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance as if the storm building inside had summoned its natural counterpart. How long? Jake demanded, grabbing his aunt's wrist so tightly that she winced. How long before he gets here? Let go of me, Miranda hissed, but there was something in Jake's eyes that made her comply when he didn't release her. He was already in the city for business. Maybe 30 minutes. Claire felt the world spinning around her. 30 minutes. Half an hour before a man who had murdered Rosalind's spirit long before she died would arrive to finish what he'd started 6 years ago. We have to go, she said urgently, turning to Glenda. Right now. We'll take my car, Anne. No. Glenda's voice was quiet but firm. I'm tired of running. Glenda, you don't understand, Dr. Hayes said, struggling to his feet. Jasper Blackstone isn't just dangerous because of what he did to Rosalind. He's connected. Police, judges, city officials. He's the one who made sure the investigation into Rosalind's abuse allegations disappeared. He's the one who... I know exactly who he is, Glenda interrupted, and there was something in her voice that made everyone stop and stare at her. I've known for 6 years. I've been watching him, learning about him, waiting. Jake's face went pale. Glenda, what are you saying? She reached into the envelope she'd been clutching and pulled out something that made everyone's breath catch. It wasn't just letters. It was photographs, documents, financial records. I didn't spend 6 years just surviving, she said quietly. I spent 6 years building a case. Rosalind wasn't his only victim. There were others. Our others. The revelation hit like lightning. Claire stared at her sister with a mixture of awe and terror. You've been investigating him. Claire whispered. Alone. Not entirely alone, Glenda said, and for the first time since she'd arrived, a small smile crossed her lips. Turns out Rosalind wasn't the only one who called for help that night. She pulled out her phone, an older model, clearly secondhand but functional, and showed them a text thread. The contact name simply read Angel. I've been working with someone who knew Rosalind. Someone who believed her when no one else would. Someone who's been gathering evidence against Jasper Blackstone for years. Jake read over her shoulder, his eyes widening as he scrolled through the messages. This is Glenda. This is enough to put him away forever, he breathed. Why didn't you come forward before? Because I needed to be sure, Glenda said simply. And because I needed to be strong enough to survive what comes after. 6 years ago, I was a broken 16-year-old girl who couldn't save her cousin. Now I'm a woman who's going to make sure no other little girl ever has to go through what Rosalind did. Miranda Cole had gone deathly pale as she listened to this exchange. You're bluffing, she said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. You can't have anything solid. Jasper is too careful. Glenda turned to look at her, and the expression on her face was unlike anything any of them had ever seen from the shy girl they remembered. Your nephew Jake has been sending Jasper updates about his location and activities for the past 3 years, she said calmly, including detailed reports about his drinking habits, his whereabouts on specific dates, and his emotional state. Jake's face went white as ash. How do you know that? Because Angel isn't just someone who believed Rosalind, Glenda continued. Angel is someone who's been watching all of you. Someone who knew that Jake's guilt would eventually drive him to confess, and that when he did, Jasper would want to silence him too. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. Jake's comfortable life with his aunt hadn't been protection, it had been surveillance. Every report he'd sent to assuage his guilt had actually been intelligence gathering for Jasper Blackstone. Miranda, Dr. Hayes said slowly, his voice filled with dawning horror. You've been feeding information to a child predator for 3 years. I've been protecting my family, Miranda snapped, but her defiance was cracking. Jasper promised that if we kept Jake safe and quiet, he'd leave us all alone. Safe? Jake's voice was barely a whisper. You call this safe? Miranda has been using me to track down other victims. Every time I told him I was struggling, every time I mentioned meeting someone new, he couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The implications were clear and horrifying. Claire felt sick. How many? She asked quietly. How many other girls? Glenda's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it before looking up with grim determination. Angel says he's 10 minutes out, she said. But there's something else. Something I need to tell you before he gets here. She turned to Jake, and the look in her eyes was filled with a pain that went deeper than guilt, deeper than grief. I remember the phone call now, she said softly. Rosalind's call that night. And I remember something else. Jake's breathing became shallow. Glenda. I remember that you tried to stop me from going, she continued. I remember that you said we should call the police, call her parents, call someone who could actually help her. And I remember that I wouldn't listen because I was drunk and angry and I thought I could save everyone. Tears were streaming down both their faces now. I remember that you got in that car because you couldn't let me go alone, Glenda said. And I remember that when we crashed, the first thing you did was try to get Rosalind out of the water. You nearly drowned trying to save her. The weight of this revelation was staggering. Jake had spent 6 years carrying guilt for a rescue attempt that had nearly cost him his own life. I also remember, Glenda said, her voice growing stronger, that you were the one who pulled me out of the water. You saved my life, Jake. And then you let everyone believe you were dead to protect me. Claire gasped. What? Jake wasn't living comfortably for 6 years, Glenda said, her eyes still locked on his. He was in hiding too. The person living in Miranda's guest house is Jake's twin brother Justin. Jake has been in Portland, working construction, sending every penny he earned to help Rosalind's mother get away from Jasper Blackstone. The revelation hit like a tidal wave. Miranda Cole staggered backward, her face a mask of shock and betrayal. That's impossible, she breathed. Justin died in a skiing accident 2 years ago. I went to his funeral. No, Jake said quietly, his voice steady for the first time since this nightmare began. Justin faked his death so he could take my place here safely. I've been the one in hiding. And I've been working with Angel to build this case. He turned to Glenda, and the love in his eyes was unmistakable. I've been in love with you since we were 15 years old, he said simply. The night of the accident, I was going to tell you at the party. That's why I offered to drive you home. I thought maybe on the way. He shook his head. When Rosalind called, when we went to save her, I knew that telling you how I felt would have to wait. And when she died, when you blamed yourself, I knew it might have to wait forever. But you waited anyway, Glenda whispered. I would have waited 100 years, he said. Because you were worth waiting for. Because you were worth everything. The moment hung between them like a bridge across 6 years of pain and separation. But even as they reached for each other, even as Claire felt her heart breaking and healing simultaneously at the sight of her sister finding love in the midst of tragedy, the sound of car doors slamming outside shattered the fragile hope. Jasper Blackstone had arrived. And he hadn't come alone. Through the ballroom windows, they could see 3 black SUVs parked in the circular drive. Men in dark suits were getting out, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this kind of work before. Angel had been right about one thing: Jasper Blackstone was connected. Connected enough to bring what looked like a private security team to a wedding. Connected enough to make people disappear permanently. Miranda Cole looked out the window and laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or sanity. "You stupid children," she said. "Did you really think some photos and financial records would be enough? Jasper owns half the police force. He owns judges. He owns people you've never even heard of." She pulled out her phone again, this time showing them a different message thread. "Including the people who've been helping you build your little case," she said with vicious satisfaction. "Angel said to tell you goodbye." The last message in the thread was a simple photo, a woman's body floating face down in the Willamette River. Glenda's scream cut through the air like broken glass as she recognized the face in the photo. Angel, the woman who had believed Rosalind, who had helped build the case, who had been their only ally in seeking justice, was dead. And now Jasper Blackstone was here to finish what he'd started 6 years ago. The false hope of justice, of safety, of finally being able to stop running, crumbled around them like a house of cards in a hurricane. They were trapped in a ballroom full of witnesses who didn't understand the danger, facing a man who had the power to make all of them disappear, with nowhere to run and no one left to help them. But as Jasper Blackstone's shadow fell across the threshold of the ballroom, Glenda reached for Jake's hand, and for the first time in 6 years, she wasn't alone. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Even if together meant dying. Jasper Blackstone entered the ballroom like death in an expensive suit. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from decades of getting away with the unthinkable. Behind him, 6 men in dark suits spread out across the room with military precision, blocking every exit. The wedding guests who remained in the ballroom fell silent, sensing predator among them even if they didn't understand the nature of the threat. "Well, well," Jasper said, his voice carrying easily across the marble floors. "Glenda Hartwell, you look just like your cousin did at 17. The comparison was deliberate, calculated to wound, and it hit its target perfectly. Glenda flinched as if she'd been slapped, but she held her ground. "Jasper," she said, her voice steadier than anyone expected. "Still hunting children, I see." His smile was cold as winter morning. "Still making accusations you can't prove, I see." He gestured to one of his men, who immediately moved toward the remaining wedding guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jasper announced, his voice taking on the practiced tone of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. "I'm afraid there's been a family emergency. I'm going to need everyone to exit the building immediately. The authorities will be here shortly to handle a situation involving some very disturbed individuals who have been making false accusations against prominent members of our community." The guests began to murmur and move toward the exits, but Victoria Nash, the wedding planner, stepped forward with surprising courage. "I don't think anyone should leave," she said firmly. "This is clearly an intimidation tactic, Anne." She never finished the sentence. One of Jasper's men moved faster than thought, and Victoria collapsed to the floor, unconscious but breathing. "Anyone else have concerns about my request?" Jasper asked pleasantly. The remaining guests fled. Within minutes, the ballroom was empty except for Jasper's team and the small group gathered around the twins. Dr. Hayes had positioned himself protectively near Claire, while Jake moved to stand beside Glenda. "Much better," Jasper said, straightening his cuffs. "Now we can have a proper family conversation." He pulled out a tablet and showed them the screen. It displayed a live stream from what appeared to be a warehouse, where a young woman was tied to a chair, a gag in her mouth and terror in her eyes. "Do you recognize her, Glenda?" Jasper asked conversationally. "This is Jessica Morrill, 19 years old. She works at the diner where you've been employed for the past 2 years. Sweet girl. Reminds me a lot of Rosalind, actually." Glenda's face went white as paper. "Let her go," she whispered. "She doesn't have anything to do with this." "Oh, but she does," Jasper said with mock sadness. "You see, Jessica has become quite fond of you over these past 2 years. She considers you something of a big sister. She even came to me 3 weeks ago, asking questions about a case you two had been discussing. Questions about Rosalind Hartwell. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Jake stepped forward, his fists clenched. You bastard, he snarled. She's just a kid. They are all just kids when they start asking the wrong questions, Jasper replied pleasantly. The question is, what are we going to do about it? He gestured to another of his men, who produced a phone and began typing. Here's what's going to happen, Jasper continued. Glenda, you're going to come with me quietly. You're going to sign a confession stating that you murdered Rosalind Hartwell in a fit of jealous rage 6 years ago. You're going to admit that everything you've said about me was fabricated out of guilt and mental illness. And if I don't? Glenda asked, though they all knew the answer. Jessica dies. Slowly. And then we move on to your sister's new husband. Then your sister herself. Then Jake. Then that old doctor over there. I have all the time in the world, and an unlimited supply of creative ways to hurt people. The trap was perfect, inescapable. Glenda had spent 6 years building a case, only to discover that her enemy had been building a web around everyone she cared about. But then Claire stepped forward, and the look in her eyes was pure steel. What if we have something you want more than revenge? She asked. Jasper raised an eyebrow. Such as? Claire pulled out her phone and showed him the screen. It displayed a bank account balance that made everyone in the room except Jasper himself gasp. $37 million, she said calmly. My inheritance from our grandmother's trust. It becomes available on my wedding day. She looked at her sister, and the love in her eyes was unmistakable. I'll give you all of it, she said. Every penny. In exchange for everyone's safety and a guarantee that you disappear from our lives forever. Jasper studied the phone screen, and for the first time since he'd entered the room, he looked genuinely interested. That's generous, he said slowly. But you're forgetting something important. He gestured to one of his men, who immediately grabbed Dr. Hayes by the arm. This man has been lying to police for 6 years about a federal crime. He falsified death certificates. He helped a murder suspect escape justice. Even if I take your money and disappear, he's still going to prison for the rest of his life. Dr. Hayes straightened his shoulders. I'm prepared for that consequence, he said quietly. Are you prepared for your granddaughter to face those consequences? Jasper asked with vicious satisfaction. The question hit Dr. Hayes like a sledgehammer. His granddaughter was 8 years old, his only family since his wife had died 3 years earlier. She had nothing to do with any of this, Dr. Hayes said, his voice breaking. Didn't she? Jasper pulled out another photo, this one showing a little girl walking home from school. Funny thing about accessory charges. They can be very flexible in their interpretation. The web of control was complete. Jasper had leverage over everyone in the room, and he knew it. But as he savored his victory, he failed to notice that Jake had been slowly moving closer to him. Failed to notice that Glenda had been watching the positions of Jasper's security team with the trained eye of someone who had spent 6 years learning to survive. Most importantly, he failed to notice that Derek Cole, who had been silent through this entire exchange, was no longer in the room. Here's my counteroffer, Jasper said, pulling out a contract that had clearly been prepared in advance. Everyone signs this document admitting to various crimes and conspiracies. Everyone agrees to never speak about Rosalind Hartwell or myself again. And in exchange, I let Jessica live and you all get to spend your remaining years in prison instead of in graves. He set the contract on a nearby table along with a pen. You have 60 seconds to decide. That's when the lights went out. The ballroom plunged into darkness so complete it was like being buried alive. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting everything in an eerie red glow, but in those crucial seconds of blindness, everything changed. Jake lunged toward Jasper, tackling him to the ground. Glenda dove for the table, grabbing the contract and the tablet showing Jessica's location. Claire screamed for Dr. Hayes to get down as Jasper's security team opened fire. But the gunshots weren't aimed at them. They were aimed at the ceiling, where Derek Cole had somehow managed to access the building's electrical system and cut the power to the main ballroom. He was rappelling down from the service area above, using what appeared to be climbing gear he'd retrieved from somewhere in the building. The wine cellar, he shouted as he landed. There's a tunnel to the parking structure. As the group scrambled toward the exit Derek had indicated, Glenda caught Jake's hand and pulled him close. Whatever happens, she said urgently, I need you to know that I love you too. I've loved you since we were 15. I've loved you through every nightmare, every lonely night, Every moment I thought I might die from missing you." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, a kiss that tasted like 6 years of separation and the possibility that it might be their last. "We're going to survive this," he said against her lips. "We're going to save Jessica, and we're going to have the life we should have had." "I know," she said, and for the first time in 6 years, she actually believed it. But as they ran toward the wine cellar, as gunshots echoed behind them and Jasper Blackstone's voice roared orders to his men, neither of them saw the small device that had fallen from the contract when Glenda grabbed it. A tracking device. Jasper Blackstone had been 3 steps ahead from the beginning. The contract had been bait. The tablet showing Jessica had been bait. Even his arrival at the wedding had been orchestrated. Because Jasper Blackstone didn't just want to silence Glenda Hartwell. He wanted to draw out everyone who had helped her. Everyone who knew the truth. Everyone who posed a threat to his carefully constructed life. And now they were all exactly where he wanted them. Running scared, separated from help, heading toward a location he had already prepared for them. The wine cellar wasn't an escape route. It was a tomb. And by the time they realized the truth, it would be far too late to save anyone, including Jessica, who had never been in danger at all, but was actually one of Jasper's operatives, planted at the diner 2 years ago specifically to monitor Glenda's activities. The romance that had sustained them through 6 years of separation, the love that had given them hope, the trust that had brought them together. All of it was about to be tested in ways that would either forge them into something unbreakable or destroy them completely. The midpoint devastation was complete. Everything they thought they knew was wrong. Everyone they thought they could trust had been compromised. And the man hunting them had been controlling the game from the very beginning. The wine cellar was a trap. They realized it the moment they descended the stone steps and found themselves in a room with no other exits. What Derek had mistaken for a tunnel was actually just a storage alcove, and the heavy steel door they'd entered through was already swinging shut behind them with the finality of a coffin lid. "No, no, no," Claire whispered, throwing herself against the door, but it was too late. The electronic lock had engaged, and through the small window in the door, they could see Jasper's men taking positions in the hallway beyond. The wine cellar was elegant, lined with thousands of bottles worth more than most people's homes, but it was also effectively a prison. Stone walls 3 feet thick, no windows, no secondary exits, and now no way out. How did he know? Jake demanded, turning on Derek with fury in his eyes. How did he know about the cellar? "I don't know," Derek said, his face pale with shock and growing realization. "I thought the building schematics showed a service tunnel. I was trying to help." Dr. Hayes slumped against one of the wine racks, looking every one of his 73 years. "He's been planning this for months," he said quietly. "Maybe years. We never had a chance." Glenda was staring at the tablet she'd grabbed during the chaos, her face a mask of growing horror as she scrolled through what she was finding. "Jessica," she whispered. "Oh God, Jessica." She turned the tablet around so the others could see. The live stream they'd thought showed Jessica in danger was actually a recording, playing on a loop. But worse than that, the metadata showed it had been recorded 2 years ago. "She's been working for him the entire time," Glenda said, her voice breaking. "Every conversation we had. Every time I trusted her with information about the case. Every time I told her I was scared or lonely or..." She couldn't finish. The betrayal was too complete, too devastating. Jake moved to comfort her, but she stepped away, wrapping her arms around herself. "Don't you see?" she said, tears streaming down her face. "It's my fault. All of it. If I hadn't been so desperate for a friend, if I hadn't been so stupid." "Stop." Claire's voice cut through her sister's self-blame like a knife. "Just stop. This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault." But even as she said it, Claire was facing her own crushing realization. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages with growing dread. "The inheritance," she said suddenly. "The $37 million. She looked up at the group, her face white with shock. "It's gone. The account's been emptied. The transfer happened an hour ago." The revelation hit like a sledgehammer. Dr. Hayes looked up sharply. "That's impossible. The inheritance was in a protected trust. It couldn't be accessed without my husband's signature," Claire finished hollowly. "As my legal spouse, Derek automatically became co-trustee when we married." All eyes turned to Derek, who had gone deathly pale. "I didn't sign anything," he said urgently. "Claire, I swear to you, I didn't." His phone buzzed. Then again. Then a third time in rapid succession. With shaking hands, He pulled it out and showed them the screen. 3 digital signatures, all bearing his name, all authorizing the transfer of Claire's inheritance to an offshore account controlled by Jasper Blackstone. Digital forgery, Dr. Hayes said grimly. With Jasper's connections, he could have had those prepared months ago. The trap was perfect in its completeness. Not only had Jasper captured them physically, but he'd also stripped them of the one bargaining chip they'd thought they had. There's more, Glenda said, her voice hollow as she continued scrolling through the tablet. The evidence I spent 6 years collecting. All the financial records, the photographs, the witness statements. She looked up, her eyes dead with despair. They are fake. All of them. Jasper's people created them and fed them to me through Jessica. I've been building a case against him using evidence he manufactured himself. The psychological devastation was complete. Everything Glenda had sacrificed for, every painful step of the investigation she'd thought would bring justice for Rosalind, had been an elaborate deception designed to draw her out of hiding. Jake slammed his fist against the stone wall, his knuckles coming away bloody. 6 years, he said, his voice raw with rage and despair. 6 years we've been dancing to his tune. 6 years we've been playing a game where he wrote all the rules. There has to be something, Claire said desperately. Some way out. Some weakness we haven't seen. But even as she said it, Jasper's voice echoed through hidden speakers in the wine cellar. I'm afraid not, my dear, he said, his tone conversational and utterly without mercy. You see, this particular room was designed specifically for this purpose. The previous owner had some very particular tastes when it came to handling problems. The speakers crackled slightly before his voice continued. The walls are soundproof. The air circulation system can be controlled remotely. And the temperature can be adjusted to, well, let's just say it can be adjusted. As if to demonstrate his point, the room began to grow perceptibly warmer. You have approximately 6 hours of breathable air at current temperature, Jasper continued. Less if I decide to accelerate the process. But don't worry, I'm not planning to let you suffocate. That would be far too merciful. A new screen descended from the ceiling, displaying what appeared to be a live video feed of the ballroom above. Jasper stood in the center of the room, no longer alone. With him were 3 people who made everyone in the wine cellar gasp in horror. Rosalind's mother, Margaret Hartwell, stood beside Jasper with dead eyes and trembling hands. Next to her was Dr. Hayes' 8-year-old granddaughter, Lily, who was crying but trying to be brave. And finally, there was a young man who looked exactly like Jake, his twin brother Justin, whom they'd thought was safely hidden. As you can see, Jasper said pleasantly, I've been busy gathering the remaining loose ends. Margaret here has been very helpful in explaining to me exactly how devastated she would be if she learned that her daughter's death was preventable. And little Lily is such a sweet child. It would be a shame if her grandfather's crimes resulted in her spending her formative years in foster care. He gestured to Justin, who was clearly terrified but trying to maintain composure. And Justin has been telling me fascinating stories about his brother's activities over the past few years. It seems Jake has been far more involved in building this case than any of you realized. In the wine cellar, Jake's face had gone white as ash. His bluffing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Justin wouldn't. Wouldn't what? Jasper's voice came through the speakers again. Wouldn't try to protect the people he loves? Wouldn't make difficult choices when faced with impossible situations. The screen zoomed in on Justin's face, and they could see the family resemblance clearly now. The same bone structure, the same eyes, but where Jake's face showed 6 years of guilt and determination, Justin's showed 6 years of fear and compromise. You see, Jasper continued, Justin has been my insurance policy. While you were all running around playing detective, he was providing me with regular updates on your activities. Not because he wanted to, of course, but because sometimes good people are forced to make terrible choices. The revelation shattered what remained of Jake's composure. He collapsed against the wine rack, his whole body shaking. I told him everything, he whispered. Every plan, every piece of evidence, every safe house. I thought he was dead, so I talked to his grave. I told him everything because I needed to tell someone. The cemetery, Dr. Hayes said with dawning horror. Jasper's been monitoring the cemetery. Recording devices in the headstone, Jasper confirmed cheerfully. Amazing what modern technology can accomplish. And before you blame poor Justin too harshly, you should know that his cooperation was ensured by the simple expedient of threatening to hurt his brother. Funny how love makes people so predictable. The psychological warfare was devastating in its precision. Every relationship, every trust, Every hope had been systematically poisoned. The group was trapped not just physically but emotionally, each person isolated in their own private hell of guilt and despair. Now, Jasper continued, we come to the fun part. You each get to make a choice. New screens descended, each one showing a different scene. Margaret Hartwell was being shown photographs of Rosalind's final hours. Dr. Hayes' granddaughter was being told that her grandfather was a criminal who had helped murderers escape justice. Justin was being forced to watch video footage of his brother's activities over the past 6 years. Here's how this works, Jasper said. Each of you can save one person from suffering. But to do so, you have to sacrifice someone else in that room with you. The moral trap was perfect in its cruelty. Glenda, Jasper continued, you can save Margaret from learning the truth about how her daughter really died. But to do so, you have to tell me which of your companions deserves to die first. Claire, you can save Dr. Hayes' granddaughter from a lifetime of trauma. But you have to choose whether your sister or your husband faces the consequences. Jake, you can save your brother from further torture. But you have to decide whether Glenda or Claire pays the price. Dr. Hayes, you can end your granddaughter's suffering immediately. But you have to pick which of these young people dies to make that happen. And Derek, Jasper's voice took on a particularly cruel tone, you can save your new wife from all of this. You can walk out of that room right now, free and clear, with a guarantee that you'll never see me again. All you have to do is unlock the door and leave the others behind. The screen showed a keypad next to the door, and a code appeared, 080617. Rosalind's birthday. For a moment, the only sound in the wine cellar was the gentle hum of the air circulation system and the soft weeping of people pushed beyond their breaking point. You have 30 minutes to decide, Jasper said. And remember, choosing not to choose is also a choice. If no one steps forward to make the hard decisions, then everyone suffers. Everyone dies. And everyone above suffers as well. The screens went dark, leaving them in the warm red glow of the emergency lighting, facing choices that had no right answers and consequences that would destroy souls regardless of what they decided. In the silence that followed, Glenda slowly walked to the center of the room and sat down on the cold stone floor. I know what you're all thinking, she said quietly. You're thinking that this is my fault. That if I hadn't come back, if I had just stayed dead, none of you would be here. Glenda, Claire started, but her sister held up a hand. And you're right, Glenda continued. This is my fault. All of it. Rosalind's death, your ruined wedding, the danger you're all in now. Everything. She looked up at them, and the peace in her eyes was more terrifying than any rage could have been. So I'm going to fix it, she said simply. I'm going to tell Jasper that I'll confess to Rosalind's murder. I'll sign whatever he wants me to sign. I'll say whatever he wants me to say. And when it's over, when I'm dead, the rest of you will be safe. Like hell, Jake said fiercely, moving to kneel beside her. We're not giving up. Not now. Not ever. Look around, Jake, Glenda said sadly. We're trapped in a stone box with no way out, no weapons, no help coming, and no leverage. Jasper has thought of everything. He's always been 3 steps ahead. Then we get 4 steps ahead, Claire said suddenly, her voice filled with a determination that surprised everyone, including herself. She was staring at the tablet Glenda had set aside, and the expression on her face was unlike anything any of them had ever seen. What are you talking about? Dr. Hayes asked. Claire picked up the tablet and began typing rapidly, her fingers flying across the screen. Jasper made one mistake, she said, not looking up from her work. He's so arrogant, so sure he's thought of everything, that he gave us access to his entire system. She turned the tablet around, showing them what she'd found. This isn't just monitoring Glenda, she said. This is monitoring everything. Every operation, every victim, every crime he's committed for the past decade. Real evidence this time. Real financial records. Real victim statements. Hope began to flicker in their eyes, but it was fragile, desperate hope. It doesn't matter, Glenda said softly. Even if we had real evidence, we're still trapped down here. And he still has innocent people upstairs. Not necessarily, Dr. Hayes said slowly, his old mind working through possibilities. Jasper made another mistake. He assumed I was just a small-town doctor who stumbled into this situation. He pulled out his phone, showing them a contact list that made everyone's eyes widen. I wasn't just Rosalind's doctor, he said quietly. Before I retired to general practice, I spent 15 years as a forensic psychiatrist for the FBI. I still have contacts. People who have been looking for Jasper Blackstone for a very long time. The revelation shifted the dynamic completely, but it also made their situation more desperate. If help was coming, they needed to survive long enough for it to arrive. And if Jasper suspected they had found real evidence or called for real help, he would accelerate his timeline. They were no longer just fighting for their own lives. They were fighting to prevent Jasper Blackstone from disappearing forever, taking his secrets and his future victims with him. But first, they had to survive the next 27 minutes without anyone breaking under the psychological pressure and making the terrible choice that would tear their group apart. In the growing heat of the wine cellar, surrounded by bottles worth millions and trapped by walls that had witnessed unthinkable horrors, 6 people prepared to face their darkest hour. And somewhere above them, Jasper Blackstone was about to discover that the game he thought he was winning had rules he'd never imagined. 23 minutes. The digital countdown on the tablet seemed to pulse with malevolent life as the temperature in the wine cellar continued to rise. Sweat beaded on everyone's faces, and Dr. Hayes had already loosened his tie and removed his jacket. The ventilation system, Claire said suddenly, looking up at the ceiling. If we can access it. Reinforced steel grating, welded in place, Jake said grimly. He'd been examining every inch of the room while the others worked on the evidence files. This place was designed to hold people, not let them escape. On the screens above, Jasper's psychological torture continued. Margaret Hartwell was being shown crime scene photographs from Rosalind's death, each image more devastating than the last. Little Lily Hayes was asking why the bad men were saying her grandfather was a criminal. Justin was being forced to recite back conversations he'd had with Jake's gravestone, each revelation cutting deeper into his brother's soul. 18 minutes, Dr. Hayes said quietly, checking his watch. Even if my contacts are mobilizing, they won't get here in time. Glenda stood up abruptly, her decision written across her face with devastating clarity. I'm ending this, she said, walking toward the keypad by the door. Glenda, no, Jake said, grabbing her arm. We agreed. We didn't agree to anything, she said, gently pulling free of his grip. You all want to keep fighting because you still have hope. But I've been running from this for 6 years, and I'm tired. I'm so tired of other people getting hurt because of me. She reached for the keypad, but Claire stepped in front of her. Move, Glenda said softly. No, Claire replied, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before, a strength forged in fire. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my mistakes. Your mistakes? Glenda laughed, but it was a broken sound. Claire, this isn't about you. Isn't it? Claire's eyes blazed with sudden fury. I'm the one who married a man who publicly humiliated you. I'm the one whose wedding became the trap that caught us all. I'm the one whose inheritance Jasper stole to fund whatever comes next. She stepped closer to her sister, and when she spoke again, her voice was raw with 6 years of suppressed guilt. I'm the one who didn't fight hard enough to find you after the accident. I'm the one who gave up looking. I'm the one who let everyone convince me you were really dead because it was easier than admitting I'd failed you as a sister. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. You want to sacrifice yourself. Claire continued. Fine. But I'm going first. This is my wedding, my family, my responsibility. She moved toward the keypad, but this time it was Derek who stopped her. Actually, he said quietly, I think I'm the one who should make this choice. Everyone turned to stare at him, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Derek Cole looked like a man instead of a spoiled boy. You're all forgetting something important, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Jasper offered me a way out. A clean escape. All I have to do is walk away. Derek, Claire breathed, you can't be serious. Why not? He asked, and the pain in his eyes was genuine. Look at what I've done. Look at who I am. 3 hours ago, I stood in front of 200 people and humiliated a woman who had survived 6 years of hell because I thought she was beneath me. He gestured around the wine cellar, his voice growing stronger. I've spent my entire life taking what I wanted and never thinking about the cost to other people. I married you for your money, Claire. Not because I loved you, but because I wanted what you represented. The confession hit Claire like a physical blow, but Derek continued before she could respond. But watching you today, he said, his voice softening, watching you fight for your sister, watching you choose love over safety over and over again, I finally understand what I've been missing my whole life. He looked at Glenda, and the shame in his eyes was absolute. I can't undo what I said to you earlier. I can't take back the cruelty. But I can make sure it doesn't cost anyone else their life. No, Jake said fiercely. We don't abandon each other. Not now. Not ever. You're not abandoning me, Derek said with a sad smile. You're letting me finally do something worthy of the woman I married. He moved toward the keypad, but as his finger approached the numbers, the speakers crackled to life again. Well, well, Jasper's voice filled the room, dripping with amusement. How touching. Young Derek finally grew a conscience. The screens flickered back to life, but instead of showing the hostages, they showed a different scene entirely. Jasper stood in what appeared to be a control room, surrounded by banks of monitors displaying feeds from locations all over the city. But I'm afraid your noble sacrifice isn't going to work, Jasper continued. You see, I lied about the keypad. Oh, it will open the door, certainly. But it will also release a gas into this room that will kill everyone else within 30 seconds. The revelation shattered what remained of their hope. Even the choice to sacrifice one person to save the others had been a trap. You're wondering why I would do such a thing, Jasper said conversationally. After all, dead martyrs are so much less fun than living victims. But the truth is, I need you all to die here. Tonight. Together. He gestured to the monitors around him, and they could see that each screen showed a different crime scene, a different victim, a different family destroyed by his actions. You see, tomorrow morning, there's going to be a tragic story in all the newspapers. A wedding that turned into a murder-suicide. A disturbed young woman who returned from the dead to destroy her sister's happiness, killing everyone in a fit of rage before taking her own life. The scope of his plan was breathtaking in its evil. Not only would he eliminate the witnesses to his crimes, but he would frame Glenda for mass murder, destroying her memory and any chance that future investigations might uncover the truth. The beauty of it, Jasper continued, is that it ties up so many loose ends. Rosalind's death becomes part of a pattern of violence by an unstable individual. Dr. Hayes' decades of evidence tampering becomes the desperate act of a man trying to cover up his patient's crimes. And poor Derek becomes the innocent victim of a family destroyed by secrets and lies. Dr. Hayes slumped against the wall, the weight of understanding crushing him. The FBI contacts, he said hollowly. You've been monitoring my communications. They are not coming. Oh, but they are, Jasper said with delicious satisfaction. They are coming to investigate a mass murder. They'll find exactly the evidence I want them to find, and the case will be closed within a week. The trap was perfect in its completeness. Every move they had made, every hope they had clung to, had been anticipated and turned against them. But then Glenda began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, but it grew stronger, more confident, until it filled the wine cellar with a sound that was somehow both defiant and joyous. You made a mistake, Jasper, she said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. Did I? He asked, but for the first time, there was uncertainty in his voice. You assumed I came here tonight alone, Glenda said, her smile growing wider. You assumed I was still the broken 16-year-old girl who ran away 6 years ago. She pulled something from her pocket, a small device that none of them had seen before. But I'm not that girl anymore, she continued. I'm a woman who spent 6 years learning how to fight monsters. And I didn't come here to stop you, Jasper. I came here to end you. The device in her hand beeped once, and suddenly every screen in Jasper's control room went black. What the hell? Jasper's voice cut off abruptly. Angel didn't die, Glenda said calmly, speaking to the now silent speakers. The body you showed us was someone else, another one of your victims that we used to fake her death. She's been inside your organization for 8 months, gathering real evidence, real financial records, real victim testimony. The screens in the wine cellar flickered back to life, but now they showed a different scene. FBI agents in tactical gear were storming Jasper's control room. Other screens showed simultaneous raids on dozens of properties across the city. And while you were focused on us down here, Glenda continued, she was uploading everything to every major news outlet, every law enforcement agency, and every international human rights organization on the planet. Jasper's scream of rage echoed through the speakers before cutting off entirely. The gas, Dr. Hayes said urgently. If the system's been compromised. There is no gas, Jake said suddenly, understanding flooding his face. Glenda, you knew. You knew it was a bluff. She nodded, her eyes bright with tears of relief and exhaustion. I've been working with Angel for 3 years, she said. Everything I told you about building a case alone was partly true, but I wasn't really alone. We knew Jasper would eventually try something like this. We just had to get him to reveal the full scope of his operation. So the evidence on the tablet, Claire started. Real evidence, planted there for him to find, Glenda confirmed. We needed him to think he was in control. We needed him to feel safe enough to bring all his resources to bear at once. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the realization of how close they had all come to making irreversible choices. "The hostages upstairs," Dr. Hayes said urgently. "Safe," Glenda assured him. "Angel's team extracted them 20 minutes ago. What you were seeing on the screens were recordings, designed to manipulate your emotions." As if summoned by her words, the heavy door to the wine cellar swung open, and a woman in FBI tactical gear stepped through. She was in her 30s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had seen too much but refused to become bitter. "Agent Sarah Morningstar," she said, showing her badge. "Though I believe you know me as Angel." She looked directly at Glenda, and the affection between them was unmistakable. "Good work, partner," she said with a smile. "Though next time, maybe warn me before you disappear into an underground bunker with no communication for 40 minutes. "Next time?" Jake asked, looking between the two women. "You're planning to keep doing this?" Glenda turned to him, and the love in her eyes was infinite. "Actually," she said softly, "I was hoping to retire from the monster hunting business. I've got 6 years of living to catch up on, and I'd like to do it with the people I love." But even as relief flooded through the group, even as they realized they were safe and Jasper's reign of terror was finally over, the cost of their choices lingered in the air between them. Derek had been willing to sacrifice himself for people who barely knew him. Claire had been prepared to give up everything to save her sister. Jake had been ready to face a lifetime of guilt to protect the woman he loved. Dr. Hayes had been willing to let his granddaughter suffer to save the others. And Glenda had been prepared to die rather than let anyone else pay for her perceived sins. They had all stared into the abyss of impossible choices and discovered who they really were when everything was stripped away. Now they had to learn how to live with that knowledge. But first, they had to face Jasper Blackstone one final time. Because even with his organization in ruins and his crimes exposed, even with FBI agents swarming his properties and his victims finally getting justice, the man himself was still unaccounted for. And Jasper Blackstone had one last card to play. One final trap that would test everything they thought they had learned about love, sacrifice, and the true cost of justice. The impossible choice hadn't been which of them would die. It had been whether they would choose to live as the people they had become. And that choice was still waiting for them in the ballroom above. They emerged from the wine cellar to find the ballroom transformed into a war zone. FBI agents moved through the space with practiced efficiency, photographing evidence, securing the scene, and coordinating with field teams across the city. But something was wrong. Agent Morningstar's radio crackled with urgent updates, each one more troubling than the last. "Control room was empty when we breached," came a voice through the static. "Looks like he cleared out 20 minutes ago." "All secondary locations are clean," reported another agent. "Financial records show massive fund transfers to offshore accounts starting 6 hours ago." "He knew," Glenda said quietly, watching the organized chaos around them. "Somehow, he knew this was coming." Agent Morningstar's face was grim as she listened to the reports flooding in. "Teams 7 and 8, report," she spoke into her radio. "Team 7 here." The warehouse location was a decoy. No hostages, no evidence. Just video equipment for staging the fake feeds. Team 8 reporting. "Jasper Blackstone's residence is empty. Looks like it's been cleared out for days." The realization hit them like a physical blow. Jasper hadn't just been controlling the game. He'd been prepared to abandon it entirely if necessary. "How is that possible?" Claire asked. "You said you'd been watching him for months." Agent Morningstar's jaw tightened. "We were watching the organization, not the man himself. He's been using body doubles, voice modulators, digital stand-ins. The Jasper Blackstone we've been tracking might not have been the real one for weeks." Dr. Hayes sank into one of the ballroom chairs, looking every one of his 73 years. "Then it was all for nothing," he said heavily. "The evidence, the raids, all of it. He's gone." "Not gone," said a voice from the ballroom's main entrance. "Just saving the best for last." Everyone spun toward the sound, and there stood Jasper Blackstone himself. But something was different about him now. The expensive suit was rumpled, his perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and there was a wild look in his eyes that spoke of a man who had nothing left to lose. Behind him stood 20 men in dark suits, but these weren't the professional security team from before. These men had the look of mercenaries, killers who would do anything for the right price. "Hello, Rosalind," Jasper said, looking directly at Glenda. The name hit the room like a bomb blast. Everyone stared at Glenda, confusion and growing horror warring on their faces. "I'm not Rosalind," Glenda said quietly, but there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before, a tremor of uncertainty. Jasper laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or sanity. "Oh, but you are," he said, pulling out a tablet that showed what appeared to be DNA test results. "You see, I've been wondering for 6 years how two 16-year-old girls could look so much alike without being related. How Glenda Hartwell could survive a car crash that should have killed everyone in it. How she could carry so much guilt for someone else's death." He began walking closer, his men fanning out to cover all the exits. "So I ran some tests on the DNA samples Dr. Hayes so helpfully preserved from the crime scene," Jasper continued. "And do you know what I found?" The silence in the ballroom was deafening. "The girl who died in that car wasn't Rosalind Hartwell," Jasper said with vicious satisfaction. "Rosalind Hartwell has been alive this entire time, living as Glenda, carrying the guilt of her cousin's death because the trauma was so severe she blocked out her own identity." The revelation shattered reality around them. Claire staggered backward, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I would know my own sister." "Would you?" Jasper asked mockingly. "When was the last time you saw Glenda and Rosalind together? Really together, in the same room, where you could see both their faces clearly?" The question hung in the air like poison gas. Claire's face went white as she tried to remember, tried to recall a single clear memory of the twins and their cousin all in the same place. "The birthday party," she said weakly. "They were both at the birthday party." "Were they?" Jasper pulled out another device, this one showing video footage from that night 6 years ago. Or was it just Rosalind, moving between groups of people, letting everyone assume there were two girls present? The video was grainy, but as they watched, a horrifying pattern emerged. Every time Glenda appeared on screen, Rosalind was nowhere to be seen. Every conversation, every interaction, showed only one girl moving through the party. "The psychological trauma of the abuse created a dissociative identity," Jasper continued, his voice taking on the clinical tone of someone discussing a fascinating case study. "Rosalind created Glenda as a way to cope with what I was doing to her. The stronger personality, the braver one, the one who could survive what Rosalind couldn't." He gestured to the woman they had known as Glenda, who stood frozen in the center of the ballroom. When the car crashed, when her cousin died, the trauma shattered the barrier between the identities. Rosalind couldn't face the reality of who she was, so she became Glenda completely. She's been living as her own imaginary sister for 6 years. The weight of this revelation was crushing. Jake stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion and desperate love. "I don't care," he said fiercely. "I don't care what her name is or what happened to her mind. I love her. All of her." "How touching," Jasper said with mock sympathy. "But there's one more thing you should know about your precious love story." He gestured to one of his men, who produced a thick file and handed it to him. "Jake Henderson was never at that party 6 years ago," Jasper said pleasantly. "He was with me. All night. He's been working for me since he was 14 years old." The words hit like lightning strikes. Everyone turned to stare at Jake, who had gone white as fresh snow. "That's not true," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Jasper opened the file, showing photographs that made everyone gasp. Jake, clearly younger, clearly terrified, in rooms that spoke of unthinkable horrors. Jake with bruises. Jake with the hollow eyes of someone whose childhood had been stolen. "Jake was one of my first victims," Jasper said conversationally. "But unlike the others, he survived. And eventually, he learned to be useful." He showed them more photographs, these ones recent. Jake meeting with men in suits. Jake receiving envelopes of cash. Jake reporting on Glenda's movements over the past 6 years. "Every safe house she found, I knew about," Jasper continued. "Every job she took, I approved. Every friend she made, I vetted first. Jake has been my eyes and ears, making sure my little Rosalind never wandered too far from home." The betrayal was total, devastating. Glenda, or Rosalind, stared at Jake with eyes that held the death of every dream. "You've been working for him," she whispered. "All this time. The letters I wrote to you. The love I thought we shared. It was all real," Jake said desperately, dropping to his knees in front of her. "Everything I said, everything I felt, it was real. Yes, I was reporting to him, but I was also protecting you. Every piece of information I gave him was designed to keep you safe." "Safe," she laughed, but it was a broken sound. "You call this safe?" "I call it alive," Jake said simply. For 6 years, you've been alive because I made sure you were exactly where he expected you to be. Because I convinced him you were broken, harmless, no threat to anyone. He looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. I've been playing a part for 8 years, he said. Pretending to be loyal to him while actually working to bring him down. Every report I filed was approved by Agent Morningstar. Every movement you made was protected by a team you never saw. Agent Morningstar stepped forward, her weapon drawn but not yet aimed. It's true, she said quietly. Jake's been our inside man for 3 years. Everything he's done has been under our direction. But Jasper just smiled, the expression of a man who had saved his best card for last. How lovely, he said. Everyone working together, playing their parts so beautifully. But there's just one tiny problem with your touching story. He pulled out one final device, this one showing a live video feed. Agent Sarah Morningstar died in a car accident 18 months ago, he said pleasantly. The woman you've been working with, the woman you've trusted with your lives, has been working for me the entire time. The final betrayal hit like a nuclear bomb. Everyone turned to stare at the woman they had thought was their salvation, and her expression confirmed their worst fears. Sorry, she said with genuine regret. But some games are bigger than individual players. The trap was perfect in its completion. Every ally was compromised. Every plan was known. Every hope was a lie. But as Jasper savored his victory, as his mercenaries closed in for the final act, something unexpected happened. Glenda, Rosalind, whoever she was, began to laugh again. You made one mistake, Jasper, she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone, including herself. And what's that, my dear? He asked indulgently. You told me who I really am, she said simply. And for the first time in 6 years, I remember everything. She turned to face Jake, and the love in her eyes was infinite and unbreakable. I remember that night, she said softly. I remember calling for help. I remember you racing to save me. I remember choosing to get in that car with you because I trusted you more than I trusted anyone else in the world. She looked at Claire, and the bond between them transcended names and identities. I remember that you always protected me, she said. Even when I was someone else, even when I forgot who I was, you never stopped loving me. She turned to Dr. Hayes, her voice filled with gratitude. I remember that you saved my life by helping me disappear. Not because you were covering up a crime, but because you were protecting a child who couldn't protect herself. Finally, she faced Jasper, and the fear was gone from her eyes. And I remember that you're not the monster I've been afraid of for 6 years, she said with calm certainty. You're just a broken man who never learned that love is stronger than fear. She stepped forward, and something in her movement made Jasper's mercenaries hesitate. I forgive you, she said simply. The words hit Jasper like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face cycling through confusion, rage, and something that might have been grief. You can't, he whispered. After everything I've done, after everyone I've hurt, you can't just forgive me. I can, she said gently. And I do. Because carrying hate is too heavy, and I'm done being afraid. That's when the real FBI agents arrived. They came through every entrance at once, moving with the precision of a team that had been planning this moment for months. But these weren't the agents who had been in the building before. These were the real task force, led by Agent Patricia Reeves, a woman whose reputation for bringing down organized crime was legendary. Jasper Blackstone, Agent Reeves announced, her voice carrying the authority of absolute justice. You're under arrest for human trafficking, murder, conspiracy, and about 40 other federal crimes. The mercenaries tried to resist, but they were outnumbered 3-1 by federal agents who had been waiting their entire careers for this moment. Jasper was handcuffed within 30 seconds, but as they led him away, he looked back at the group one final time. This isn't over, he said, but his voice held no power now. You think you've won, but there are others. There are always others. Maybe, Rosalind said calmly. But there are also people like us. People who choose love over fear. People who choose to protect instead of prey. And we'll be ready for them. As Jasper disappeared into federal custody, as his organization crumbled around the evidence that had been gathering for years, as justice finally began to flow for victims who had waited decades for someone to believe them, the group stood together in the ruined ballroom. Rosalind turned to Jake, her eyes bright with tears and infinite possibility. So, she said softly, my name is Rosalind Hartwell. I'm 18 years old, and I've been dead for 6 years. Want to help me figure out how to live again? He took her hands in his, and when he spoke, His voice was steady with the certainty of someone who had found his purpose. "I'm Jake Henderson," he said. "I'm 24 years old, and I've been in love with you since the moment I met you, no matter what name you were using. And yes, I want to spend the rest of my life helping you remember how to be happy." They kissed then, surrounded by FBI agents and broken dreams and the remnants of a wedding that had become something so much more important than anyone could have imagined. Claire watched her sister, her cousin, the girl she had loved regardless of biology or memory or trauma, find peace in the arms of a man who had risked everything to protect her. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Claire smiled. "So," she said to Derek, who stood beside her with wonder in his eyes, "I guess we're not married after all." The paperwork was signed by Claire Hartwell, but Rosalind Hartwell was never legally able to be my maid of honor. Derek looked at her, and the love in his eyes was real this time, earned through fire and transformation. "Then I guess I'll have to propose to you properly," he said, dropping to one knee right there in the middle of the chaos. "Claire Hartwell, will you marry me? Not for money or status or convenience, but because you're the strongest, bravest, most beautiful person I've ever known, and I want to spend my life becoming worthy of your love." "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "But we're doing it in a courthouse. I've had enough of big weddings for one lifetime." Dr. Hayes watched the young people find their happiness and felt a peace he hadn't known in years. His granddaughter was safe. The truth was finally out. And justice, real justice, was finally being served. But most importantly, love had won. Not the easy love of fairy tales, but the hard love of people who choose each other despite trauma and betrayal and impossible circumstances. The love that transforms monsters into healers and victims into survivors and survivors into heroes. As the sun rose over the city, casting golden light through the ballroom windows, 6 people who had faced the darkness together prepared to step into whatever came next. Together. And for the first time in 6 years, Rosalind Hartwell was no longer afraid of the light. 3 months later, the courthouse steps were nothing like the grand marble staircase of the Cole estate, but Rosalind Hartwell had never felt more beautiful. She wore a simple white dress, not a wedding gown, just a sundress that had cost $30 at a thrift store, and she was surrounded by the people who loved her for exactly who she was. Claire stood beside her as maid of honor, radiant in a yellow dress that complemented her sister's simple elegance. Dr. Hayes waited nearby with his granddaughter Lily, who clutched a handful of wildflowers they'd picked that morning. And there, at the bottom of the steps, Jake Henderson waited in a borrowed suit, his eyes bright with the kind of happiness that comes from surviving hell and choosing love anyway. "You ready for this?" Claire asked softly, squeezing Rosalind's hand. Rosalind looked down at the small crowd that had gathered. Agent Reeves stood with her task force, all of whom had become unlikely friends over the past months of testimony and trials. Victoria Nash, the wedding planner, had insisted on organizing this ceremony for free, calling it the most important event I've ever coordinated. Even some of the original wedding guests had come, drawn by a story that had transformed from scandal to inspiration. But most importantly, scattered throughout the crowd were faces Rosalind was just beginning to recognize, other survivors of Jasper Blackstone's organization, women and men who had found the courage to come forward after seeing what was possible when people chose to fight back instead of hide. "I'm ready," Rosalind said, and meant it completely. As they walked down the steps together, Rosalind caught sight of her reflection in the courthouse windows. 6 months ago, she had been a scared girl in a faded dress, trying to disappear into the shadows of someone else's celebration. Now she was a woman in a simple white dress, walking toward her future with her head held high and love in her heart. The ceremony was brief but perfect. Judge Martinez, who had personally volunteered to officiate after following the case in the news, spoke about the transformative power of truth and the courage required to build a life on authentic foundations. "Do you, Jake Henderson, take Rosalind Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded wife?" she asked. "I do," Jake said, his voice steady and sure. "I take all of her, Rosalind, Glenda, whoever she needs to be on any given day. I take her trauma and her healing, her nightmares and her dreams, her past and her future. I choose her, completely and forever." "And do you, Rosalind Hartwell, take Jake Henderson to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Rosalind looked into Jake's eyes and saw their entire future spread out before them. Not perfect, not easy, but real and honest and built on the kind of love that survives anything. Claire stood in the kitchen of the house she and Derek had bought together, a modest 2-story in a neighborhood where children played in the yards and neighbors knew each other's names. It was nothing like the mansion she'd grown up in, and it was absolutely perfect. The verdict's in, Derek called from the living room, where he'd been watching the news coverage of Jasper Blackstone's final trial. Claire joined him on the couch, curling up against his side as they watched the reporter announce that Jasper had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. More importantly, his conviction had opened the floodgates for dozens of other victims to come forward, and the investigation had expanded to include accomplices and enablers across multiple states. "It's really over," Claire said softly. "This part is," Derek agreed. "But Rosalind's right, there will be others. There always are. And there will always be people willing to fight them," Claire said with quiet determination. Derek had surprised everyone, including himself, by becoming a passionate advocate for child protection services. He'd used his family's connections and wealth to fund safe houses and legal aid services, transforming his privilege into purpose in ways that made Claire fall in love with him all over again every day. "Speaking of fighting," Derek said with a grin, "are you ready for tonight?" Tonight was the first annual gala for the Rosalind Hartwell Foundation, the nonprofit organization Rosalind and Jake had started to help trauma survivors rebuild their lives. It was being held at the same venue where the disastrous wedding had taken place, transformed now into a celebration of survival and healing. "More than ready," Claire said, kissing her husband's cheek. "Let's go help my sister save the world." That evening, Rosalind stood at the podium in the same ballroom where she had once been humiliated and nearly destroyed, looking out at an audience of 500 people who had come to support the foundation's work. She wore a blue dress that Jake had chosen because it matched her eyes, and her voice was strong and clear as she addressed the crowd. "A year and a half ago, I walked into this room believing I was someone I wasn't," she began. "I was carrying trauma that didn't belong to me, guilt that wasn't mine to bear, and shame that had been placed on me by someone who wanted to keep me small and afraid." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. "I was publicly humiliated in this very spot by someone who thought my pain made me worthless," Rosalind continued, her gaze finding Derek in the crowd. He nodded with a small, sad smile, acknowledging the journey they'd all taken together. "But what that person didn't understand, what my abuser didn't understand, is that trauma survivors aren't broken. We're not damaged goods. We're not victims forever." Her voice grew stronger, more confident. "We are warriors. We are healers. We are the people who look directly at the darkness and choose light anyway. We are the ones who transform our pain into purpose, our scars into strength, our survival into service." The applause began slowly, then built to a thunderous crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. "The Rosalind Hartwell Foundation exists because every survivor deserves to know they are not alone," Rosalind continued when the applause died down. "Every child deserves to be believed. Every victim deserves justice. And every person who has ever felt worthless deserves to know that their life has meaning, their story matters, and their future is bright with possibility." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, survivors and supporters, law enforcement and advocates, strangers who had become family through shared commitment to justice. "So tonight, in this room where I once felt my smallest, I want to announce that we've raised enough money to open our first residential facility," Rosalind said, her voice breaking with emotion. "A place where children aging out of foster care, survivors leaving dangerous situations, and anyone who needs a safe space to heal can find sanctuary." The crowd erupted again, and this time Rosalind let the tears flow freely down her cheeks. When the gala ended, when the last supporter had gone home and the last piece of equipment had been packed away, Rosalind found herself alone in the ballroom with the people who mattered most. Jake stood beside her, solid and steady as always. Claire and Derek held hands nearby, their faces bright with pride and love. Dr. Hayes sat in a chair with Lily sleeping on his shoulder, both of them peaceful in ways that would have seemed impossible 18 months ago. "So," Claire said softly, "how does it feel to be back where it all started?" Rosalind looked around the ballroom, seeing not the scene of her humiliation but the birthplace of her transformation. This was where she had learned that love was stronger than shame, that truth was more powerful than lies, and that the people who choose to stand with you in your darkest moments are the ones who make life worth living. "It feels like coming home," Rosalind said simply. "Not to who I was, but to who I was always meant to become." Jake squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back, their fingers intertwined like their futures, their hearts, their unbreakable commitment to facing whatever came next together. Outside, the city hummed with the quiet energy of people building lives worth living. Somewhere out there, other survivors were taking their first steps toward healing. Other predators were being brought to justice. Other love stories were beginning in the most unlikely places. Rosalind Hartwell, no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer afraid, walked out of that ballroom hand in hand with the man who had loved her through every identity, every nightmare, and every triumph. Behind them came the family they had chosen and the future they had fought to create. The girl who had once been publicly humiliated for daring to exist was now a woman who had publicly transformed pain into purpose, survival into service, and trauma into triumph. And in the months and years that followed, as the foundation grew and flourished, as other survivors found their voices and their strength, as justice continued to be served and healing continued to spread, Rosalind's story became proof that no matter how dark the night, no matter how impossible the circumstances, love always finds a way. Love finds a way to heal. Love finds a way to hope. Love finds a way to transform even the most broken places into sacred ground where miracles are not only possible but inevitable. The wedding day that was supposed to symbolize love and new beginnings had collapsed into trauma and terror. But from those ashes had risen something far more beautiful than any fairy tale or real love story, built on truth and tested by fire, that would last forever. What did this story teach you about the power of choosing love over fear, even in our darkest moments? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.